Hello, my name is Clive Woods, and I'm going to talk to you today about High Royds Psychiatric Hospital, the former High Royds Psychiatric Hospital, which closed in 2003. It was built in 1888 and went through various name changes, but was very important in the history of the West Riding of Yorkshire. My background is that when I retired, I joined my local civic society, Aireborough Civic Society, and very early on, this was one of the heritage buildings that we had to take a great interest in. So we found in the newspaper a disturbing report of damage to that wonderful building in Manston. It had closed, and in the paper it was telling us that a lot of damage had been done by thieves taking lead from the roof. This happens to lots of empty buildings. The report said the whole sections had been taken, and film footage, it said, showed water pouring in from the roof, despite the claims that the building was secure by the developer. So I had to take myself down and have a look at what had happened. It had closed in 2003. Planning permission had been granted in 2005 for lots of new building, but a condition that the historic buildings were converted. But when I went in 2007, lots of new building, but no conversion of historic buildings, as you can see from these pictures. The top ones are the new build. David Wilson had purchased part of the site, and top left is where their development took place. In the slide to the right, you can see other new building, and below you can see one of the Asylum blocks. This is in 2013, that photograph, many years after the closure, and it's derelict. And if you look closely, you can see where lead has been taken from the roofs. And the farm workers' buildings were still in a bad way until very recently. So I had to find out more. I'm not an expert in mental illness. I was coming at it from a heritage point of view, and so I wanted to find out more. Well, I knew that we hadn't been very good at looking after mentally ill people back in Victorian times and before, and all the reading dictated that. The early asylums were very hit and miss, private, there were a lot that were depicted in various reports as being atrocious. In London, you may have heard of Bedlam, the Bethlehem Hospital, founded very early on, but no one knew how to treat mentally ill people. Often it was thought that it was their own fault and they deserved to be in the predicament they were in. So by the 1770s, institutions were being provided, and here's one of the early ones, not far away from us in Leeds. This is Bootham Park Hospital in York. It's still there. It only closed in 2015, and that had been built in 1772, and the famous architect John Carr was responsible. It's Grade 1 listed. However, there was a lot of criticism of the way that inmates were treated there back in the early 19th century, and the Quaker, John Tuke, felt that the treatment was poor. But a Quaker called Hannah Mills died after she was admitted to that hospital. No one was allowed to visit her, and therefore the Quakers decided to build a new hospital called the Retreat, where more humane treatment was given. Restoring people, occupational therapy, farm working on the farm, walks, quiet surroundings. So this was a change, and this idea was spread, particularly at the time when the King George, was suffering from mental illness. You will have seen perhaps the film The Madness of King George. So a law was passed in 1808 that county asylums could be built for the mentally ill. And in the West Riding of Yorkshire in 1818, the first asylum was built in Wakefield, Stanley Royd. It closed in 1995. It was for 120 patients initially, and it has been converted. And then a second asylum was built in the West Riding near Sheffield, Wadsley. Two photographs of that. The bottom left shows the asylum when it was still being used, but very sadly, a later photograph on the bottom right shows a totally derelict building. And clearly, once it closed, it was allowed to go to rack and ruin. I don't know whether it still exists in any form, but at least our High Royds Hospital never experienced that sort of damage. So the West Riding of Yorkshire. As you can see, the first two asylums were in the south of the county, and at the time of the Industrial Revolution in Victorian times, of course, Leeds and Bradford and all the industrial towns were booming and increasing in population. So there's a clear need for another asylum. The two existing asylums were overcrowded and full, and a new site was looked for near Leeds and Bradford. So a site was chosen in the northwest of Leeds, at Menston, at that time in the West Riding. You can see from a modern picture of the site on the right-hand side that it's still surrounded by countryside, but Menston itself and Guiseley both have expanded considerably. And it fits with the idea that you want an asylum in a peaceful place to make sure that the patients can have a good environment. One thing I draw your attention to, on the 1890 Ordnance Survey map, we have the lunatic asylum shown. We also, just to the southwest, have High Royds, which was an old farm yeoman's building, and here it is, High Royds Hall. That was there, been there presumably since the 17th century or before, but apart from that, it's countryside and farmland. So the Ordnance Survey map again, just showing the plan of the asylum. And as you can see, it's almost symmetrical. Very carefully planned, south-facing, so that maximum amount of daylight and sun. It's got a cricket ground. It's got an infectious diseases hospital set away from the main building. A modern view, because there are some good walks around the site of the building, which I'd recommend you to try out. And here we have the hospital in the background, and the footpath is just behind me. So how did it all start? Well, it was 1888. The railway between Leeds, Bradford and Ilkley had just been built and passed close to the site. That was perhaps one of the reasons why that particular site was chosen. As you can see, there's a branch line from the main railway into High Royds Hospital, and all the materials were brought in. There's a very nice photograph from 1901 showing the chimney, which is now unfortunately gone, of the boiler room, and the electric railway in front. And it had been electrified, I think, about 1897. There was a bridge bottom right that went underneath what is now the A65. That has been filled in, but the bridge is still there, so you can find it. And until recently, where the railway came into High Royds to the store rooms, there was the canopy still there where the engine would have stopped. Unfortunately, that was removed in 2018. In 1885, before the hospital was built, a painting by Herbert Martin shows its situation in the countryside, shows the fine buildings, the main administrative building there in the middle. The buildings on the right are for female patients, all the buildings on the left are for male patients. And rather curiously, in the foreground is a church, but that was never built. So the construction, 1886 to 1888, the land was bought from the Fawkes family of Farnley Hall, related to the Guy Fawkes family, the infamous, and here we can see the construction taking place. I've tried to identify where the admin building is before the tower was built, and the building on the left, which is one of the wards, that is the building above it as it was being built. Cost was £350,000, which apparently is 135 millions now. So it really, they did splash out. There was no expense spared. It was built to last. The earliest photograph is on the left. You can see a wooden turret on top of the tower, which was there in 1901, but hasn't been there for many years. And you can see the ornate decoration in the admin building. The fine windows, stained glass, the Bermontoft tiles, the mosaics in the floor. And here are more views of the fine decoration, the tiles, the glass, and a photograph, an early photograph showing how they liked houseplants in those days. And it's full of the corridor is absolutely full. And I think it's actually the same corridor that is below. It's hard to imagine now. So nowadays, this is the admin building. Of course, that's just the main building, but there are lots of wards to either side. A later photograph, 1939, showing the site, showing the extent of this community, and that's what it was. It had all the things that you would need really provided within the community. Detailed plans were made before the building construction took place, and here we have a difficult to read and very detailed plan. So when I started doing walks round High Royds, it was necessary to make it a bit clearer. And so I superimposed all the facilities. The admin block right at the bottom, which is the one you have seen already in the slides. On the right-hand side is the female side. On the left-hand side, the male side. And the only time male and female met was on a Friday night in the ballroom when they had a dance and both female and male were in the same room, but otherwise totally separate. And so really on each side, very similar, quite similar layouts, certainly in terms of the wards. So the design, well, the site cost 18,000, which is a lot less than the total cost, isn't it? The building was designed by Vickers Edwards, who was, I think, the surveyor architect for the West Riding at that time. It was built to an echelon plan, and this was a new idea of design where all the wards face south. Different types of patients would be entirely separate on each side. The sick and infirm were at the centre for ease of nursing. So that is the first block nearest the admin block for male and female, 2 blocks, and there for the sick and infirm. The epileptics were on the away from the main building, apparently where they would be least disruptive, and incurable patients were right at the back, the chronic block. So it was virtually a self-sufficient community. The fine marble floors and tiles were made by William Ingham and Sons of Wortley near Leeds. The ballroom was decorated with fine glass windows, wooden panels, fine fireplaces. There was a boardroom with plasterwork and very finely decorated. It was planned for 1,440 patients to live in the wards. Each one had a common bedroom. Patients were either private or sent by poor law unions from Otley, Leeds, Ripon, the surrounding West Riding. And the focus was on humane treatment and constructive employment. So if we look at the plan, though, you can see all the facilities, aside from the blocks on each side, and there are 4 of them. You have, if I go from a clockwise direction around, the attendants, by the way, are the equivalent of nurses for the male wards. So females were attended to by nurses, but if you were a male patient, they were called attendants. Towards the back of the site, you have, if you like, the working parts. You have the artisan workshops, blacksmiths, joiners, and all the trades that you would need to maintain the site. They had their own fire station, which was actually used, at once needed to be used on one occasion, a timekeeper's cottage, stores, it had its own kitchen and bakery. On the female side, and this will be because the female residents were involved in the running of the laundry. The laundry actually, patients actually had their own residence with a drying ground to the side. Then right on the outskirts, you have bottom right-hand side, you have parkland and you have a cricket pitch, and there was a bowls pitch somewhere, and there were farms to the north of the site. One other thing I would point out, on each side, for each ward, there were shelters away from the main blocks, because there was a belief at that time that fresh air was particularly beneficial, as it is indeed. So if we look at in more detail at one of the blocks, and this is a block that didn't suffer the damage of the other blocks, because the social club that had existed when the hospital closed were moved into the acute block on the male side. So you can see us looking at the building in the bottom photograph on the left. You can see a plan, an original plan of the block, and really it's split into two main areas: the dormitory with lots of beds and a day room where the patients were in the daytime. Of course, when we were there, the social club were there. The day room top left is empty, but was used for functions at the time, and various clubs met there. And it had a very fine floor, I believe. And the dormitory, which is the photograph bottom right, had a billiard table in, which in the time of the asylum would actually have been in the day room. Whether it was the same one, I don't know. I think I'd pick out also the bathroom facilities to the north of the main block. They had 2 bathrooms, 8 WCs, washing facilities. So it was particularly well thought out. And for its time, ahead of its time, when you think of the housing and the slums in the middle of many cities. Finally, on the far right-hand side, there were about 7 or 8 single rooms. I think those were for the more disturbed patients. But when we were there, we were told by Tom Booth, who worked there from 1953 until closure and was running the social club, or was involved in the social club, that in the later years, patients wanted to go into the single rooms, and it was a sort of treat to be out of the dormitory. So there we are looking at the building before we go on a tour. Now, to try and get an idea of what it was like in 1888, and please bear in mind that things changed an awful lot in the following 123 years or so. We do have a 1901 photograph. We do have a photograph of one of the medical officers right at the beginning, an assistant, James Whitwell. We do have that photograph of the Central Hall. And these early photographs, or most of them, were taken by Dr. O'Connor Donnellan, who worked at the asylum for 7 years before he sadly went to Middlesex and was only there for 9 years before he died from pneumonia. But these photographs essentially from what he took. And you can see at the top of the steps on the right is Dr. Donnellan and other medical staff, all very smartly dressed. And apparently it's one of those shelters away from the main building where they are posing. So what was it like to work there? Well, there are advertisements for jobs there. Nurses in 1888 were wanted. That was when it was opening. Preference would be given to those possessing good voices and who are able to read music. Previous asylum experience necessary. And then another one 2 years later, wanted a shoemaker. We were required to act as an attendant, i.e. a male nurse. Preference would be given to a singer who can read music. You had to be 5'8" and you got £30 when you started. You were expected to lodge. I mean, it's provided, but you were expected to be there. And that applied to nurses and attendants. So, but you can see here, they're very keen on music, and that it seems to be a very important qualification. And of course, it's part of the ethos of entertaining the patients. So photographs from 1901, 12 years after the asylum opened. And Well, with top right, we have a dormitory, all the rows, all the beds in a row. And the other photographs show the day rooms. You can see the billiard table in one photograph. The top left shows a very ornate arrangement. Lots of plants, it would appear. This is the ballroom on the top left-hand side, decorated for perhaps Christmas. The stage seems to have a set background. On the right-hand side is a 2014 picture when I did get to look inside, I think. And at the bottom, we had a picture of a production group. So the fire brigade practicing in 1901, the tailor's shop, here are the stores. Everything was unloaded from the railway deliveries here. And here's a view of people working on the farm, inmates working on the farm. Leisure, this is the cricket pitch. It is still there. You can go and see it. In the background is the female block, one of the blocks. And in the newspapers, they were asking for the cricket club at the Asylum wanted, in 1902, they wanted some teams to play. And there are quite a lot of reports in newspapers of matches, cricket matches at the Asylum. Local groups came into the Asylum to perform plays. And here's one from 1915, a comedy. Ici on parle français. I don't know how many of the inmates knew French, but this was one of 3 plays given. It was a comedy, and the names of the people who took part are in the cutting. But it was not all enjoyment and entertainment. There were tragic events inevitably at the Asylum. There were escapes as well, and on the left-hand side we have an example of that. Someone escaped, went home, and 2 warders mounted bicycles and rode off to Cleckheaton to find the inmate at his mother's house. And it was 16 miles, so they had some good exercise, and they had no difficulty in persuading him to return to the Asylum, it says. But a suicide on the right-hand side, and I think there were a number of suicides over the years. When the inmates arrived at the Asylum, for many years, they were photographed. This is the Photographic Studio, and I presume this is where all the inmates were photographed when they arrived. There's a book, Voices from the Asylum by Mark Davis, and that has examples of people who were taken to the Asylum. And I think most of these died at the Asylum, were buried in the graveyard adjacent. So when there were clearly reports when the person arrived, and that was recorded, and their progress also was recorded. And the book has details of many inmates. So Joseph Smithers, he came from Ripon. He was a private patient. He was only 18. He'd been in jail twice. Delusions of persecution. He'd threatened his mother. And he was there for 6 months, I think, and discharged, but later he came back as a pauper. And he's an interesting case because it's thought they had a very wealthy family. Joseph, grandson of wealthy Joseph Smithers, who owned Perseverance Mills at Elland. So quite what happened there, I don't know. Another example is Mary Kemmie, who came in 1898 and was there until she died. All the details of these patients, of course, are in the booklet. So many patients were buried at the asylum. I don't know how many compared to the total of number treated there. Relatives clearly took away many, but 2,861 were buried there between 1890 and 1969. The burial graveyard is the other side of the A65. It's actually rather away from the main asylum, quite near that bridge you saw earlier on. It was in a shocking state when it was taken over by a friends group and has been restored, and it's open for Heritage Open Days normally and may well be open this year. And you can see inside, it's a memorial to those that died. And there's also information you can see on the walls, large pictures of some of the inmates. So well worth a visit. Find out when it's open, have a walk around the whole site after visiting the chapel. To find out more about what it may have been like, you could also read a novel, The Ballroom by Anna Hope, set in 1911. Anna's great-great-grandfather, John Malarkey, was there as a patient from 1909 until his death in 1918, when he was 56. His notes describe him as depressed and emaciated, and he had arrived from a workhouse. So that book certainly is available in many libraries, certainly our local library at Rawdon. So some later pictures from the 1920s and 30s, and really we're quite short of pictures of inside the asylum. We've just got these, the 1901 photographs, and these from the 20s and 30s, and there aren't that many of them. But here we have a shop that has been set up. You see the works departments outside the works area, and the kitchen in the 1930s. And then we move on to closure. And when it was closed in 2003, as you can see, the building's in good condition. Fireplaces, that's in the ballroom, I think that fireplace, or the boardroom, one of the two, not sure. Corridors, you won't see the corridors now, top right, because they largely have gone in the redevelopment. And in the middle, a plaque, sadly now stolen, of those who died in the First World War and worked at the asylum. So a timeline, key things. The site has changed its name on 1, 2, 3, 4 occasions. It's now called Chevin Park. The developer renamed it when it was converted. I think I'd pick out key things that in a way surprised me, but perhaps shouldn't. It was used in the Great War for treating shell-shocked men. Of 1905, there was a fire, and so they did use their fire engine. The fact that they had wireless in 1924 and cinema. And then in 1930, talking cinema and electric lighting. And so then down to 2004, the building was, the hospital was closed, sold to Raven Group, and the ethos of the plans was for a community environment for the new use. Doctors, surgery and dentists, nursery allotment, shop, offices, workshops, and exemplar travel schemes as well. So it was welcomed as a good reuse of a very important site. But in 2008, Raven were bought by the Gladale Group, and it's taken until 2021 for the listed buildings to be converted. And sadly, none of the community services have been provided, nor were the travel schemes ever implemented. So really the second part of my talk is what happens to important heritage buildings once their original use is no longer acceptable, once they're sold on. And the building was listed, and justifiably so. It's a fine Victorian building that was made to last, and clearly it lends itself to conversion. So back in 2003, planning permission was given for conversion, with quite a lot of new housing at the back that we saw earlier. But there was an important condition: not to cause, permit or allow occupation of more than 187 of the new build dwellings until the contract for refurbishment of the listed buildings within the final development phase has been let. So my interpretation of that was that 187 new houses could be built, but then the listed buildings had to be converted. And indeed, the Yorkshire Evening Post reported on this conversion, and it will begin converting the existing listed buildings into homes, 248 in new homes in the grounds. And the managing director said there will also be a shop, a doctor, a dentist, a creche, commercial space, office and retail units. They were going to upgrade the football pitches, provide travel tickets, better bus stops to take people to the train station, and build a new private sports and social club for the social club that had been there before closure, which was continuing. So this became national news, certainly for the government at the time, and the Department for Transport included High Royds as an exemplar scheme. Public transport links to nearby stations and towns to make it sustainable. And as you can see, it sounds very good. On-site bus shelters with real-time information incorporated in the scheme. Only buses could get through to deter cars, cyclists and pedestrians, play equipment for children. So it sounds very, very good. And office space as well. And there was a need for that because back in 2005, Leeds City Council had done a traffic survey identifying the effect of the conversion. And it was going to lead to an increase in traffic on the already congested A65. And they did calculations to see how much extra from the development. And if you've got, well, it was supposed to be about 570 homes, you're looking at 570 cars, unless they can be persuaded to use bus, cycling, walking and train. Unfortunately, the train station though is about a kilometre away from Menston Station and a bit more from Guiseley, I think. So it is quite a walk, and I don't think many residents would feel it was near enough. So we have the vision, a sustainable community that replicated the original use of the asylum. We had the new build that came very quickly. But gradually, all the facilities have disappeared. Security hasn't been good. I mentioned that the plaque from those who died in the Great War was stolen. In 2013, when I first did a walk round High Royds, you could see that the listed buildings were badly neglected. I didn't get inside to see the interior, but there were quite a lot of images on the internet, and there seems to be certainly a group of people who try to get in to derelict buildings to take photographs, and another group that get in and damage listed buildings. And I think that's an example of it, and it's not good, is it? I think it's rather frustrating that once planning permission was given, the developer then puts up for sale a lot of the listed buildings. The office, retail, medical and creche items were put up for sale, and none of them materialized. Various planning applications have come over the years stating that no one wants any of these facilities, and therefore planning permission requested for more residential, and eventually that's been given. However, one part of the site did seem to be protected because people were still there, and I think that's a key thing. Empty buildings get damaged, buildings occupied survive in a much better shape. So this is the male side, this is the acute block. We've seen the insides before, and there's the plan. In 2013, everything was fine, but then I was rather distressed to call along in 2017 to find that the whole of that block had been gutted for conversion. So the interior features, of course, were lost. But by 2019, it's been converted, and you wouldn't appreciate that any damage had been done. This is the farming residence, which is away from the main part of the site, several hundred meters away. That was one of the last things to be converted. I think it was sold to someone else to convert, and I think it may actually be happening now, but last time I went, it was still a ruin. The landscape was designated by Historic England for protection as well. And rather bizarrely, in 2016, there was an application to take it off the register, to delist it. I don't know who did that and why they did that, but at the time, there were applications in to build a lot more housing on the grounds, and I think there could be a connection. Historic England refused to delist the grounds, fortunately. So in 2020, and this is, bear in mind, this is many, many years, 15 years after the planning permission, stating how they were going to have bus access to the site, but the road was still blocked by boulders until 2018. Nothing was done to provide the bus link, and an application to remove that condition. Again, that has been refused, but the road, when I last saw it, still wasn't suitable for buses. So something really needed to be there right at the beginning so that people living at High Royds had access to public transport. Still wasn't provided right at the end of the development. And of course, if you lived in High Royds, and I think the photograph illustrates this pretty well, you're quite a distance from the main A65 and from Menston. It's quite a walk, and is that going to encourage you to walk down to a fairly infrequent bus service? It really looks to me like it's become another car dominant development. So the list of buildings, the female side, this was one of the first blocks that was converted by 2013. By 2017, the ruin of the medical officer's house has been extended and converted and looks in good condition. And really right up to the present day, as the brochure says, the wait is over. This is in 2021. A few years before, coming soon, the conversion of the clock tower. And in the sales leaflet, original Victorian features have been preserved or replicated wherever possible throughout. I'll leave you to judge whether that's entirely true. We've had lots of applications changing the original, and these are just 3 of them. A key concern was the fact that the ballroom was only converted last year following a planning application asking for more new build to allow it. And whereas the original intention was that the ballroom would be a community asset for the whole local area, the planning application was not even for its use by all the residents of High Royds, but just 42 people who bought residences in the admin block, which was no longer to be offices, but was now to be converted to residential. At the same time, the workshops were also to be converted to residential. So away from High Royds, really just to put this in context, I later joined Leeds Civic Trust. I'm on the Heritage Watch Group and the Planning Committee. And sadly, High Royds isn't alone in being neglected. And here's a selection of buildings in Leeds. All of them have been empty for a very long time, probably 10 years or longer, all damaged, broken windows. People may and probably have got inside. We have Meanwood Hall, all listed buildings. We have the Rising Sun on the A65. We have the stables at Roundhay Park and Rose Court. Security on all of them very, very poor, if non-existent. And as I put here, what is being done to stop this loss of heritage? Not enough. Some more here that finally have been converted, though very much damaged before that. We have Cookridge Hospital, we have Chapel Allerton Hospital. Scott Hall Farm hasn't been converted and is in a bad way. So really, the problem of listed buildings and other heritage buildings being neglected, not looked after, needs addressing. It's not high on the agenda. They tend to get forgotten about. And I don't know how we solve that, but it's important that we do, or we won't have the Heritage for Heritage Open Days. So I would like to think that following this talk, you will visit High Royds. We're northwest of Leeds, quite near the airport. You can arrive on a bus, service 34, and sometimes service 33. You can visit the chapel. You can walk around the buildings, and now they do look very grand, and if you like, back to their former grandeur. It's the interiors that have suffered. And you can walk around the countryside, and there are footpaths around the site where you can get good views of the surrounding countryside and the hospital. So I'd recommend that. You can take the train and get off at Menston Station and walk to the site, and that would be worthwhile. So thank you for listening to this talk about High Royds Hospital, and I hope you found it interesting, and I do hope that you will visit. Goodbye.